When it comes to the three Final Fantasy games on the PlayStation 1, Final Fantasy VIII is largely considered to be the black sheep of the family. In fact, many people think it's one of the worst games in the entire series. And while there may be some people who simply don't like the game's art style or the rather moody protagonist, it's safe to say that a large majority of the hate comes from the very controversial Junction System. But I gotta say, it's actually quite brilliant in how much freedom it gives the player to experiment with the game's mechanics. So whether or not you love or hate the Junction System, I encourage you all to stick around to see some of the wonderful things that can be accomplished in Final Fantasy VIII. There are two things that set Final Fantasy VIII apart from the rest of the series. The first is that as your characters level up, so do the enemies in the game. This includes almost every boss in the game as well. And while I understand why many Final Fantasy fans aren't fond of this mechanic, I do appreciate how it's meant to encourage players to learn the game's mechanics and not resort to level grinding. The second thing that sets Final Fantasy VIII apart from the rest is how it handles magic spells. In most Final Fantasy games, magic spells must be learned, and the use of that spell will consume a certain amount of MP based on the power of that spell. But in Final Fantasy VIII, there is no MP, and spells are treated more like single-use items that you have to draw from various places on the map, or from enemies and bosses. Furthermore, these spells can then be attached to a character's stat to give it a much needed boost, seeing as how the enemies level up with you. In addition to boosting stats, elemental spells can be attached to the attack or defense of a character to help deal or protect against specific types of damage. And this is where things start to get interesting. One of the stats that you can enhance through the Junction System is called Spirit, which determines a character's defense against magic attacks. Now for the majority of the game, you want this stat and every other stat to be as high as possible. However, that may not always be the case. For example, through this setup right here, Zell now absorbs 100% of any fire damage that he takes. This means that a fire attack that would normally deal 403 damage to his HP will now heal him for 403 HP instead. But keep in mind, the Spirit stat is still taken into consideration during this calculation. So a higher Spirit stat in this instance is actually causing Zell to heal for less HP, which means that if you choose to set up a character to absorb all types of magic damage, it's actually more beneficial to keep that character's Spirit stat as low as possible. But believe it or not, this barely scratches the surface of what can be done with these stats. So now we're going to go ahead and bump Zell's Spirit back up as high as possible. And then we're actually going to go ahead and knock Zell's fire defense down to about 99%. This is not 99% damage absorbed, but rather 99% of the damage is now nullified. So now any fire magic spell will do a very finite amount of damage. Even if Zell is hit multiple times in a row, it'll still manage to do almost no damage at all. Almost a precise amount of damage. Junction, what the fuck is your function, Zell? Dude, this is so sick. Let me know if you're gonna be toking it later, dude.